This is a blink of an eye. This place is like a garbage can compared to what we're going to experience in heaven. Look, eternally, I don't think it's going to be a big deal once you get to heaven and you are millions of years from where you are now. I think you'll look back and say, that was like skinning my knee.
So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of love, especially interfaith and just in general, kind of like the global village, supporting one another, and how different faiths interpret the way that we're intended to love and should love one another, and how we should love the divine as well. So whether that be God or like the Buddha or whatever prophet you follow, how should we love them? How should we love the divine and God? And how should we love one another? And a big problem I have reconciling a personal belief in God or certain divinities is that I feel that maybe my perspective of what it means to love and to be kind to other people sometimes is unreconcilable with certain perspectives of what God wants us to do in terms of loving one another or how we should love God. And that varies faith to faith, and I have disagreements with multiple of them. But in general, I'm wondering how you guys think you can reconcile differences between how an individual believes they should love one another and love God, and how God, from one perspective or another, wants us to do that. So, for example, to deal with the idea of like homosexual couples and stuff, or just in general, if I'm a straight person, then and I want to be accepting of and support people who are not straight, then how do I reconcile that if one faith or one God tells me that I should love everyone, but yet I have to look at these people a particular way, or I can't I can't love them the way I want to because God tells me that what they're doing is not the way He intends for people to love one another, if that makes sense.
It is not to have sex with them. Instead, Christ says to love your enemy, to love all people. And to love according to Christ means to work for the good, to work for the well-being of another person. It does not mean to have orgasm with them.
Agreeable.
Okay? Secondly, Jesus points out, and the Bible points out, that there's a purpose for life, and that purpose is to love God and to love others. And to love God means to obey God. Because God is God and I'm not. So loving God is shown in the way I seek to obey Him. You know that. If I say I love God and I hate Him, there's a word for me. Hypocrite. When I say I love God, I'm going to have to love all people because Christ commands His followers to love everybody. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree that doing good, basically the idea of love is to do good and uplift one another, support one another in various ways, and has nothing to do with sex necessarily, or even like romance or anything.
Right.
Love comes in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
And another thing I struggle with, in particularly within like the Abrahamic faiths, is this idea of choosing the correct God and stuff. And I know this question comes up often, but I want to be a little more specific with it. And there's this whole idea, especially around the time of Protestantism arising and stuff, of like, should we only follow the scripture? Should we only follow our faith? Like what salvates us?
You bet.
And so I think a lot of Christians argue over how significant works are, like doing good deeds and supporting one another in that kind of way, like loving one another in that way.
Right.
And I take a lot of inspiration in kind of like studying Sikhism. I don't know if you know a lot about it, but one thing they emphasize a lot is seva and the idea of doing service, not only for the sake of doing good deeds and loving one another, but also as a form of worship and loving God.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably one of their foremost, if not their like foremost principle.
Right.
And I'm wondering, especially from the Christian perspective, why can't one be salvated only by like righteousness and good works, as opposed to having to have the right God and the right works, or just God? For example, like I was just talking with my friend. What about the Buddha? Would the Buddha go to heaven? I think almost unanimously people would agree that he's fairly righteous. Most faiths believe that he is some kind of predecessor to Christ, or Muhammad is the prophet. Or he's a saintly figure in many faiths. So what about these people who are not falling under the umbrella of Christianity necessarily, but are kind of illustrating and enacting the values that
You bet.
Christ represents.
When you say Buddha's got to go to heaven because he was a good guy, I'm going to heaven because I'm a good old boy. Now that's a religious belief. People go to heaven because they earn it. They live a good life. You don't care if it's Buddha or a North Carolinian good old boy. We live a good life, therefore we earn heaven. Jesus Christ contradicted that religion. Jesus Christ taught that nobody's going to be in heaven because they're a good old boy or a good Buddha. Instead, because of our rebellion against God that is expressed in a myriad of different ways, we all have separated ourselves from God, but Jesus bled and died on a cross to forgive us, to reconcile us to God, and to give us eternal life. So you can't have it both ways. Either I'm going to heaven because I'm a good old boy, or I'm going to heaven because Christ loves this sinner so much, he bled and died on a cross to forgive me. Those are two different religions, and I got to decide which one is true.
If God loves us and wants us to love him by obeying him,
Yes.
Then let's say that my perspective of what love is, or that other people's perspective of what love is, diverges from that in the sense that that obeyance is not a component of love. Do I need to obey, for example, like if I'm married and I have a wife, does she need to obey me, or do I need to obey her in order for it to be love? Or should our service to one another and our love for one another be voluntary and not include kind of this expectation of one another? Basically the question is God unconditionally loving if the condition of obedience or he places expectations on us rather than simply loving us? Okay.
To obey God means I realize God is God, I am not God. And because God is God, the creator who made me for a purpose, if I say, theoretically, I love God, how I live my life is going to show whether I'm speaking the truth or lying. So Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commands. And that is why, sir, we have the word hypocrite. Christian hypocrite. Why? Because we understand that if someone says, I believe in Jesus, but I hate you, that is hypocrisy. Total hypocrisy. If I say, I believe in Jesus, and you watch me go out and womanize after speaking out here, that is hypocrisy. So when Jesus says, if you love me, you'll obey my commands, to love God does not just mean I got a wonderful positive rush when I think about God. Love is not a feeling. Love for God is obeying God. Now, love for you is not me obeying you. And my wife loves me, that doesn't mean she obeys me. And I love my wife, that doesn't mean I obey her. And when you get to the issue of freedom, sir, I can promise you, if there is no God, you ain't free. You're a pile of chemicals. You are determined by your chemicals and by your environment. And my experience of life is baloney. My experience of life is you do have a free will, but now think and ask yourself, where does my free will come from? It does not come from an electromagnetic reaction. Rather, it comes from the fact that there's a personal God who created me and gave me a free will. And that's why I can choose to work for your good, or I can cut you off at the knees. I am free. I don't have to respect you. I can be highly disrespectful to you, but I will be judged for it.
Do you believe that God is the epitome of virtue? Is he perfect in terms of whatever your perspective of virtue is, and like goodness? Do you think God is the epitome and the perfection?
Because God is eternal, goodness as a value has existed throughout eternity.
Okay.
Because goodness is defined by the character of God. God is good.
Okay. Does it not seem arrogant for God to characterize a particular relationship with humanity as one of command and obedience, or kind of like a hierarchy, when we try not to replicate that? When we're trying to practice our virtues in human society, we try not to replicate that. And I think all spiritual leaders in the past have emphasized humility, being humble, not enforcing kind of these power dynamics, and achieving equality through those kind of things. Does it not seem then arrogant and not virtuous of God to use that kind of relationship with humanity?
To be free does not mean that there are no consequences to my decisions. And if I choose to abuse my free will and hurt people, God holds me responsible. Why? Because those people that I hurt matter to God. If I go up to him, smack him in the face, and God doesn't judge me for that, let's be real honest, he does not matter to God. If someone hurts her, and God does not hold them responsible, she does not matter to God. Because he matters to God and because she matters to God, if anybody hurts you two, God is going to hold them responsible and he's going to judge them for it. You take the judgment of God out of the picture and you're up a creek without a paddle when it comes to explaining to me, do people really matter? And the conclusion, obviously, if God doesn't judge us, no, people don't matter. The same way, if you steal his wallet and the security here at Chapel Hill see you do it, and if they just say, have a good afternoon, they don't care about him. Justice is a joke. So because justice is not a joke, God judges.
Why do works and virtue not alone make us eligible, say, to go to heaven, or eligible for, whatever it be, like release from samsara or liberation of some kind? Why is good works and being good not good enough? If God has nothing to judge me for in terms of action, then why do I need to believe, or why do I need to obey his command if my actions are already in line with how he wants me to do?
Because you and I are the same. At times we both do good. But at other times we do not do good, we do evil. That's why Christ bled and died on a cross, to take the judgment that I deserve for my wrongdoing. Now, if you're a morally perfect specimen, you don't need Christ. You're morally perfect. Speaking for myself, I ain't morally perfect, and I've only had one student in 43 years of speaking on university campuses who claimed to be perfect. He was a student at MIT, and the response of his MIT classmates was exactly your response. He's sitting there, and his MIT student says, well, I'm perfect, I don't need anybody to forgive me, and everybody ripped with laughter, because we know better than that. Our consciences convict us, we've done wrong. That's why Christ bled and died on a cross.
You believe some methods of becoming better are less efficient than others?
If you and I are in a prisoner of war camp together, and my bunk gets full with different people who have come into the camp, and you have room, well, a lot of secular humanists would say, well, it's rational, it's reasonable for you to take on more of my people, just because, so we can equal the numbers. You're a kind person, right? Okay, there was a study done at the Shuntong compound, prisoner of war camp, and this secular humanist was in the war camp, and he's from Harvard, and he said, just like I had mentioned, it's reasonable, right? Do you know that those in that camp that bunk who had room, didn't take on one person? They said, we understand the math, how we could equal it out, but no, we want this extra space. Okay, so no, I don't think from a secular perspective, you can just reason to become more generous, to become more loving when the heat is really turned up. But there was somebody in that Shuntong compound prisoner of war camp named Eric Liddell. Perhaps you've heard of him, the Olympian who broke many records running. He was a strong Christian, and he said, we have a reason to sacrifice and to fill up our bunk as well because we have room. That secular humanist became a Christian because he started to realize we are not going to be able to reason our way to become more moral people. No, it's about the sacrifice on the cross that Christ did for us to change our hearts in order to say, you know what? I'm going to sacrifice for my enemy. When historically have we ever, before Christ, heard the great news of you're supposed to forgive your enemy and sacrifice for your neighbor? We never got it. Some of the Vedas and Upanishads and some of the ancient writings, you certainly have eye for an eye, you have respect your neighbor. But this was new, and this is why this Harvard secular humanist became a Christian, because he said it's a heart issue.
But I think it still doesn't really answer anything because it's very circumstantial and case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
I know of plenty of atheists who have outdone Christians in terms of great moral deeds and such. And it still goes back to the question that I asked already, which was, why can't somebody, for example, do it on their own? Why is Christianity, or why is Christ the best method of morally?
Because you're going to feel shame and guilt. You want second chances in life. Be honest. When I screw you over and you despise me for it, I am begging you, with everything in my heart, hopefully if you're a close buddy of mine, please forgive me. Please forgive me. I'm not good enough on my own. And you take on a level of debt that I'm supposed to be taking on in order to forgive me if you are continuing to want a relationship with me. And I promise you, that is not easy to do. From a secular humanist perspective, me just bettering myself, I see shame and guilt come all the time because there is no grace. There is no forgiveness. And the best defense of the Christian faith, I believe in this day and age, is forgiveness. There's a reason for it. From an evolutionary perspective, naturalistic, atheistic, there's no real reason to forgive.
What if my ability to continuously analyze my moral situation and reflect upon my own moral situation, where I was versus where I am now, is a way for me to measure my own progress and also to see what's working and not working?
Yeah, efficiency. That's kind of scary. Why wouldn't you live by cheating on exams if you can get away with it? Efficiency, I could be efficient in all kinds of ways to better myself.
What if I can compare myself constantly to a changing standard? So like one day I'm 60, let's say if there's a hypothetical 100% moral, I'm 100% virtuous. But right now I'm only 60% of that. A couple weeks later, or maybe a couple years later, I realized maybe I've been doing some things better. I've been being more virtuous. People appreciate me more. I appreciate myself more. I think more highly of myself and others. I feel that there's more kindness and love in my life. And then a couple of years later from that, 80%. I feel even better about it. And a couple of years later, 90%.
When Dostoevsky talked about, if you don't believe in God, do whatever you want, he's not saying that atheists are worse people morally than Christians. We have atheist friends that are more moral. My whole point, and Dostoevsky's whole point to you, though, is where does that standard come from? You keep saying, I'm 60% better. What does better look like? Does it better look like just because you grew up in a Judeo-Christian culture based out of Christian values that I'm more self-sacrificial, I live for human rights, I love people more? Then you're just pretending to be an atheist when you're really a Christian by these standards. Because culturally elsewhere, I promise you those standards that you live by, that you're saying you're bettering yourself by, would be radically different.
Why, let's say that hypothetically Islam said exactly the same things. Why then would I choose Christianity as, why would you select Christianity as the truth instead of, say, Islam?
Because of the evidence. First of all, Jesus Christ was a historical person. Secondly, did he claim to be God? Thirdly, did he live out a type of character where you would say, that's pretty consistent with his words, and goodness? And then lastly, did the resurrection actually occur? Or is it just kind of this Easter type of good feeling, the dying and the rising, and I have more hope for this coming year? No, I believe there's historical evidence to back it.
Okay, sir, I think it can be summarized real simple. If I call myself a believer in God, a believer in Christ, and you watch me go out and hate people, be racist, you would call me a hypocrite, right? And you'd be correct. Similarly, if I confront an atheist who says morality is relative, there is no God who defines right and wrong, Jesus is not part of the discussion right now, there is no God, creator, who defines right and wrong, it's all relative. But if you abuse an innocent child, that's really wrong. That's intellectual hypocrisy. So all we're trying to point out is, you atheists who hold so tightly to abuse of an innocent child is wrong, date rape is wrong, you are intellectual hypocrites. Because you're saying with the top of your head, there is no God, morality is relative, but then you live your life as if date rape, the abuse of an innocent child, is really, really wrong, objectively wrong.
What if I don't believe morality is relative, but I don't believe it comes from God?
It's impossible, because morality demands a mind. And if there is no God, there is no mind prior to the human mind, which means obviously it's the human mind that defines right and wrong, which means this mind defines it one way, that mind defines it another way, that mind another way, and my mind another way. It's all relative.
If God is a mind who is able to create a moral standard, then why can't I create a moral standard with mine?
Because you're not God. You're a very finite, fickle person just like I am. You're a sinner just like I am. At times you do good, and at other times you do evil, just like me.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
How do you know I'm not eternal?
How do I know you're not eternal?
Anyone is not eternal.
How do I know that you're not eternal?
Sure. What if Christ was walking among us and never announced himself?
Because the overwhelming evidence is that I wish I was as young as you. I'm not. I'm a lot older than you. And the overwhelming evidence is that you have a birthday and you're going to have a death day. The same way I had a birthday and I'm going to have a death day. And that's true of all of us here. Now, maybe you're an exception, but I doubt it. I think you and I both know that you have a birthday, you have a mom and a dad, and you're going to have a death day also, just like me.
But what if I am an exception?
What if you are an exception? Then we'll have a good talk about how unique you are.
Well, I think that was a pretty interesting conversation. But
Thank you so much. I appreciate it a lot, man. Thank you much.
Thank you so much.
Maybe you can serve for the great purpose, like the virtues. You can cultivate those virtues with a lower dose of suffering.
Okay.
Like, why do you allow so many people die for like no purpose in the eyes of atheists? Like why do you do that?
Well, atheism.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
I get your point. Like, it's about suffering and those evils serve for like good, a greater good or purpose. For example, in a Christian worldview, it's about becoming closer to God. But cannot you achieve this with a lower dose of evil and suffering? Is like allowing people die randomly the only way to achieve the purpose?
This place is like a garbage can compared to what we're going to experience in heaven. So the blink of the eye when it comes to suffering and death, we look eternally, I don't think it's going to be a big deal once you get to heaven and you are millions of years from where you are now. I think you'll look back and say, that was like skinning my knee. I know that sounds callous in certain scenarios, but if you think about eternity, that's what will happen. You will look back and it will not be as big of a nightmare and as much pain and toil as it obviously is now in our thinking and perspective on it. So yes, at times does God allow less suffering? Certainly. But who are we to play God and say, God, this is how much suffering you are to allow. This is how much suffering I need as a dosage to change in my own life. No, we can't play God. At times he allows some, at times he allows a lot. But at the end of the day, we do not know why he allows suffering, but he does not create it. He's outside of space and time. He knows what suffering will happen, but he does not will it into our lives. And so if you're going to take it from a philosophical standpoint, there is no problem philosophically why God allows pain, evil, and suffering. You know why? Because if he is big enough, if we are granting him the size and omniscience that he has, supposedly, if we grant him that, then why can't he have reasons that we don't know about for allowing this suffering? See, philosophically, you cannot debate Christianity and try and debunk a good God by that line of thinking. Because ultimately, why, for an atheist, and for somebody who just buys into simply evolution and that's it, why is it wrong? At times it can be perfect for COVID to exist. It can be great.
Like, it's irrefutable. Don't you think it's a bad argument or a bad definition?
No. Alvin Plantinga uses this argument, and no atheist has been able to defeat it. No atheist is even trying. It's the whole idea of you do not have the ability to know the exact reasons why God would have to allow evil and suffering. That stands up philosophically. Now, if there is no God, again, I want to ask you, because I just gave you all my points. Now, give me your point. If there is no God, why is it so bad?
My perspective is we shouldn't look at the bigger question directly. We should start from the things we know for sure. Like, for example, we can approach from biology. We can discuss those like specific questions that we can approach through our understanding, and so that we can approximate to the bigger questions. If we just like discuss those bigger questions, like what's the purpose of life, why there's like suffering in the world, why there's evil in the world, like it's a debate. It never ends. But if we approach it through like those small steps, I believe the bigger problem will be solved one day. And I think here
So one day,
yeah, but
we're just going to keep pushing it off.
Yeah.
And say one day, all those questions will be answered.
yeah,
1800s, you get Hammurabi's Code, and we could just say, from the languages that came from it, we'll get to a naturalistic cause. One day we'll be able to figure it out, how Hammurabi's Code somehow was fallacious. Or one day we'll just figure out gravity perfectly. even though it's simply a matter of patterns. We don't know exactly where gravity came from, or how it's so creative, or how it just, the law hangs out there, or mathematical laws as well. We get the Pythagorean theorem from it. But we don't know exactly where that came from, the creativity, the creative mind behind it. But see, if you want to act, think from a micro level, then fine, evil and suffering. Go hang by a swamp for a little while. And perhaps if you're lucky, you'll catch that frog who gets his brain slowly sucked out by an insect. And you'll see the pain that that frog is going through. Fine, you want to start at a small level like that and not ask the big questions? Well, just look at it and you got to say that that's natural. That's totally natural. The suffering, there is no God stating that suffering is really wrong and that there's a standard of good and evil. That's just how nature operates. So who am I to come and say that suffering is that wrong?
So it's appealing to instinct.
Mm-hmm. So your instinct is not bad. Whether you want to sleep with numerous women or just one woman, your instinct as a highly evolved animal, don't fight against your instinct. That's normal.
Yeah, but like how come those good instincts?
What's a good instinct? How do you define a good instinct?
For example, you've described that we are created in God's image.
No, you don't believe that, do you?
No, like we assume that you have a good instinct because of, like, I think the main issue for me, to Christians, is that Christians attribute the good things and the good intention to God, and the bad intentions to people, and there's not a clear line in that, like among good and, like, you cannot distinguish whether it's from God or whether it's from human.
Sure, I don't do that.
But
what Christians do that? Do you know?
But no, like it's irrefutable. Like the claims are.
So I'm just a machine where everything I do that's good, God makes me do, and He has done, and everything that I do that's bad is the devil made me do it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, that's where in the Bible does it say that? It doesn't say that. It says we have free will. Yes, absolutely, God operates in our lives, but no, you have. It's your free will to decide whether to live for the glory of God, whether to do right, whether to live for human rights and sacrifice for the poor, or to do evil and destroy life. And in the animal kingdom, a lot of evil goes on, and you destroy life in the animal kingdom. And why is that not natural? Why can't you just do that? That's totally fine from your perspective and worldview. See, but we live by a standard, which is, yes, we're created in God's image, and ultimately there is a right and a wrong. And you have to decide yourself whether to live by this standard of I ought not to act in a racist kind of way, and I ought to act in such a way where I love all people, or not. And if there is no God, what is your ultimate standard to say cross-culturally you always should treat people like they are worthy, whether they are in a wheelchair, whether they are lepers, or whether they are Bill Gates? You're to treat all of them equally. See, from your worldview, that doesn't stack up. It doesn't stack up.
Well, I will say, like, I do not know.
I do not know.
Yeah.
And I think you do know. I think your life shows that you know. How you treat her, I mean, why don't you cheat on her, or why don't you act selfishly all the time around her? I think there's a reason for that. So I think you do know. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode. Hit that subscribe button. We'd love for you to join the family. Also, want to invite you to our church in New Canaan, Connecticut. It's New Canaan High School, and it meets Sundays at 9:30 a.m.